everybody. Welcome back. This is On Dog Terms. I'm your host, MJ, and I'm here with my co host, Sam. We're two professional dog trainers, and we're going to talk your ear off about all things dog training and dog behavior to make your life with your dog easier. Today, we have a hot topic. We are talking about anxiety and stress today, which I'm super, super excited for. Sam, I know that anxiety isn't your favorite topic on dogs, but you're still excited for today, right?
Always, yes. It's not necessarily my favorite just because I tend to find myself being the kind of owner that also has a little bit of stress. So sometimes
Who doesn't?
I know. So
I'm the
it's
most stressed person you're ever going to meet.
messy over here. I don't know.
So I feel very strongly about this topic. I really like to dive into anxiety in dogs. And by no means am I saying I'm the best out there. Like, I still have so much to learn, just like with anything. But I really, really do love diving into anxiety. Something that I have been very, very frustrated for the last few years, though, is I feel like the term anxiety is overused and it's overdiagnosed from a medical standpoint. So, to start off today's episode, I really want to talk about what the difference is between anxiety and stress, because there is a difference. And I feel like in order to best help our dogs, we have to know which category they fall under. So, I actually printed off a couple different descriptions and definitions from different websites out there that I wanted to read so that we can get, the best example of what they are. So, I got this from Psychology Today to define stress. Stress generally refers to two things: the psychological perception of pressure on the one hand, and the body's response to it on the other, which involves multiple systems from metabolism to muscles to memory. Some stress is necessary for all living things. It is the means by which they encounter and respond to the challenges and uncertainties of existence. The perception of danger sets off an automatic response system known as the fight or flight response that, activated through hormonal signals, prepares an animal to meet a threat or to flee from it. So that is how we are defining stress, right? And stress is not all good or bad. So I feel like a lot of times today you hear the word stress and there's this negative connotation to it. Stress is a bad thing, but there's actually two types of stress. So there's eustress or eustress. I'm not the best at pronouncing things. But it's EUSTRESS, eustress, I think is how you say it. And Merriam-Webster describes that as a positive form of stress having a beneficial effect on health, motivation, performance, and emotional well-being. So that is your good stress. That is stress that you find beneficial. Basically, you think you can overcome it. Maybe you feel that stress response. I kind of equate it to like stage fright, right? Like, I am not the best public speaker. I love teaching my group classes, but every single time I start a new round, like I just had 16 new people on Saturday that I all met for the first time in my group classes. I still get that butterfly feeling in my
Yeah.
stomach, right? Like, I'm excited for it, but it's stressful. So eustress is your good stress. Distress is your bad stress, and that is defined as an unhealthy form of stress that can cause physical and mental health issues. Distress can be caused by prolonged or intense stressors. Anxiety, on the other hand, so anxiety can be a symptom of stress, but think of anxiety as being more internal. So you're worried about something that might happen, whereas stress is your body's response to something that is happening. And I think that's the easiest way to kind of differentiate those for our pet owners out there.
Anxiety
So,
tends to stick up here.
yeah, anxiety is in your head. Stress is more of I don't want to say just physical.
Yeah.
They both can have physical symptoms, but really anxiety is internal and stress is something external. Think of it like that, as just to keep them as the most simple things out there. And those, we can find all the different caveats and the what ifs and the buts, but that's kind of the easiest way to describe it for right now. So, what we're seeing in the dog training world is anxiety in dogs is going up and up and up. Like, so many dogs are being diagnosed with anxiety. And then you go to the vet and the vet just gives you medication and they're doing their job. I'm not saying that's always unnecessary, but I do find that a lot of the times I feel like we're jumping to medication without figuring out if it's anxiety or if it's stress and trying to relieve stress from the dog's plate. So I think we're being a little too quick to jump to medications.
Although
So
medication it can be a quick fix. It's just a Band-Aid though. It doesn't actually get to the root of why the dog is feeling the way they're feeling. And it's important to understand why the dog is feeling that way. That way we can properly help it.
yeah,
Medication sometimes is an important thing to ease the amount of anxiety the dog is having, but it doesn't actually take it away. It needs somewhere else to go. And then that's where we got to get to the root of where it's actually stemming from.
Yeah. And the medication, I mean, of course, we don't want dogs to suffer. So there's a time and a place for medication, but they don't teach a dog how to deal with stress better or how to deal with anxiety better. They don't teach them coping skills. Sometimes I've actually seen them make a dog's ability to cope with stress go down. And
Mhm.
now the dog has a lower threshold for stress. Now we have bigger problems. And then they need more medication and we end up in the spiral. So, first, let's talk about when a dog has anxiety. We're going to use anxiety as an umbrella term right now. So, somebody reaches out to a dog trainer because their dog is anxious. Is it genetics or is it environment? So, nature versus nurture. Is it both? I think it's both. Tell me your
Let's stop
thoughts.
right there. Let's kind of talk about nature versus nurture. What is that? Best way I understand it is nature versus nurture. Nature is product of environment that could be like genetics, nature of the being, the natural state of the being. That is just how that being is put into the world. Nurture is how that being is cultivated, how it is brought to feel what it is, what's its experience in life, how they experience things. That's the nurture, how we kind of cultivate and add into the relationship with the dog.
Nature is, I mean, it's self explanatory, right? It's like what nature designed your dog to be. So, genetics fall into
Na-
that.
Nature tells a lion to be a lion.
Yeah. It's what makes a German Shepherd different than a Border Collie, right? Or that, let's do a more obvious example. It's what makes a Labrador Retriever different than a German Shepherd. One is a retriever, one is part of the herding family, one is more likely to go catch a ball, while my shepherd will run around and herd everybody into a small little group and gets pissed when somebody tries to leave that group.
Right? His
And
flock
there's
is
always going to
leaving.
be, yeah, there's always going to be slight differences, but nature is what makes your dog who they are at its most base core being, basically. Nature is all of the outside influences, all of the experiences that your dog has. Sometimes I feel like,
That's where stress is implemented.
yeah,
Is the environment in which the dog is nurtured. So
yeah.
stress, good and stress can be imprinted within that as well.
Ooh, okay. I'm so glad you brought that up because this is maybe a really good example to help people start to see the difference between stress and anxiety. So, stress is going to happen in nature. It's literally every single living creature on this planet experiences stress in some forms. It's what helps us survive because it tells us when we need to escape a danger. And sometimes that is out of place. So, like when you have a deadline at work and you're stressed about it, your body doesn't know the difference between it just being a deadline at work versus like a saber toothed tiger trying to kill you. But stress is going to happen in that nature portion. Anxiety, though, can happen in the um, nature part. There's studies that have been done where when your puppy is still in its mother's womb, so it's still inside mama, and there's that whole litter of puppies. If the mother dog is very stressed from outside factors, so she has a stressful,
Say it's a rescue dog in Texas on a reservation that's living on an outside life.
yep,
That's a
and she's
stressful life for a mama being pregnant.
so that's a stressful life. But those hormones that her body makes while she's stressed actually get transferred into the puppies. And that is where we kind of blend the line, where that is a little bit of nature, because now genetically, those puppies are kind of predisposed to being anxious because their mother was very stressed during her pregnancy. So they
Yep.
had all of these stress hormones going into their little bodies while they were very literally permeable, both, metaphorically and literally. So genetics, maybe genetics isn't the best term for that, but the nature portion of what was happening to your puppy's body and all the hormones that mom was passing on can set your dog up to be prone to anxiety or have a lower threshold for stress and anxiety. Whereas stress,
Because the dog's baseline in the womb is stress.
yeah,
Like that
yeah,
at baseline, there's already negative cortisol pumping through the puppy at before we even have before humans even have the time to screw it up.
hmm,
So
yeah. So it can definitely be both. You might have some dogs that are more prone to be, influenced by one than the other, and vice versa. But what we want to talk about today in this episode is we're going to focus a lot on stress and how you can identify stress in your dog's life and how you can take stress off their plate and maybe even how you can help them better cope with stress so that hopefully
Right.
we can get them to a point where they can be successful without medication. Again, we're not saying medication is bad, but I'm sure you guys don't want to be paying for medication all the time. And I know like
For the
when
rest
I've
of
been
your life.
yeah, I know when I've been on some of those anti-anxiety medications in the past, I don't feel good when I take them. I would imagine some dogs don't feel great when they take them. I've seen dogs seem really doped up and out of it from being on those medications. So we're going to dive into stress today and really talk about how we can take that stress off your dog's plate. Depending on what you've read online, there's different terms for this. You might hear it referred to as the layered stress model. You might hear it referred to as the stress bucket analogy. If you were to look up trigger stacking, that's what we're going to be talking about a little bit. But essentially, there are these categories where you can identify stress in your dog's life and you can help take that stress off of their plate. And by doing that, you're going to help them have room for more stress. Jay Jack is kind of the guy that the way that Sam and I talk about this today is probably going to be most influenced by him. So I want to make sure we give him lots of credit because I found that his volcano analogy is probably the easiest for most people to understand. So if you imagine a volcano, before we had all that cool technology, you wouldn't know that the volcano was going to erupt until you looked at it and it was erupting. But underneath, there's all that magma building up and pressure building up in the ground. And then eventually, all of that pressure causes the volcano to explode. I want you to think of your dog like that. Triggers is a word that we use a lot in dog training. A trigger would be something that your dog reacts to. A dog passing by on a walk, the mailman walking up to your door,
The sound of your Ring doorbell, the
yep,
sound of the garage door opening, little chime that lets you know someone's going through that door. All of those things can be triggers to your dogs. Like, it doesn't have to be a bad trigger, like scared of cars, lunging at cars. It could be a trigger that someone's home and that's going to make them stressed in an excited way. But those are all still triggers that leads to a reaction of a behavior.
So think of it like that trigger is what causes your dog to explode. So a lot of people think of it like, oh, my dog has a problem with other dogs. My dog has a problem with men with blue hats on. My dog has a problem with rain jackets. I had a golden retriever once that was terrified of people in rain jackets. Those are our triggers. But underneath that is all of this stress getting added onto your dog's plate every single day. And they can only handle so much. So different people have different stress thresholds. And sometimes that varies. So, like in general, I would say my husband probably has a better stress threshold than I do. But in some scenarios, I can handle certain types of stress better than he can.
Yep.
So just because two dogs are in the same household or in the same scenario doesn't mean they can't struggle with that on different levels, or one might struggle more than the other.
I
So
really like this analogy when talking about stress and threshold with dogs. This analogy is called 13 snakes or 13 rabbits. Like, it could be anything, but I think it's originally 13 rabbit theory. So it has to do with the horse getting spooked on a trail with when rabbits run by. The horse trainer does a really good job conditioning the horse. Don't get spooked by rabbits. It's nothing to be scared of, blah, blah, blah. Does a really good job. They can go on trails, can see a rabbit or two go by, nothing happens. But one day, so it's a day when the horse sees two rabbits and then three and then four and five and six and seven. And it just keeps going. And it's not that the horse has a problem with the rabbit, it's the threshold. So it's that 13th rabbit in this analogy is what set the horse off, that it got scared and ran off. Why? What does that mean? And it just has to do with, it's not the rabbit itself. It's not like the rabbit can kill the horse. It's not like the horse has irrational fear. I would say that's an irrational fear. And sometimes irrational fears in dogs can lead to stress and anxiety, and we can talk about that. But it's that threshold. That horse can handle 12 rabbits, but that 13th, whew, that's what's going to send it
it's too
over. And
much.
sometimes that's what the dogs, like a dog who's really introverted, say hasn't been exposed to a lot of environmental stressors, they don't have a dog problem. They aren't actually aggressive with dogs or people or things outside the house. It's a threshold. Maybe they can only handle 20 minutes outside the house before they're overwhelmed and stressed. Some people can't go, can only handle going into Shields for 20 minutes before being overwhelmed. Like, it's just a thing. And sometimes environmental stress, it's not that going into Shields is a problem for us. It's the amount of stress we feel when we get there or after a prolonged amount of time exposed to it. And dogs are the same way.
Yeah, I like that analogy. I haven't heard that one before.
No, I don't know where I
No.
heard it or who I originally heard it from, but I do know Heather and I have talked about that analogy.
Yeah, I love that one. Yeah. What we're going to get into is different categories of where you as a pet owner can identify stress that might be on your dog's plate and take it off of their plate.
Yep.
However, I don't want your goal to be to take all the stress out of your dog's life because, one, that's not practical. Stress is just a part of life, it happens. I want you to make room for the stress that you can't control. And I want to help our dogs better heighten their threshold a little bit so they can deal with more stress. And there's like, we can get into what's fair, right? So, like every day in life, there's stressful things. Sam and I recorded the intro to this like 10 different times. We were very stressed about it.
Yes.
My dog was panting up a storm because he's pent up because it's been raining and he needs to go on a walk. And that was stressing me out a little bit. Like there are things that happen in daily life that are stressful that are okay. And then there are big, scary things where it's like, okay, this would not be fair to purposely put it on a dog. Like in my dog's daily lives, they need to be able to handle. I fed them 20 minutes later this morning than usual. It's really rainy and I have to do this podcast. So we can go for a normal 10 a.m. walk today. Maybe the doorbell rings because the mailman needs my signature on something. There's all these things that I expect my dogs to be able to handle that I have taught them how to handle and taken stress off their plate so they can. But if my house caught on fire and all of my dogs lost their minds, understandable, man. That's
Yeah.
really scary. I'm not going to purposely put you in that scenario. So,
Yeah. We're not going to train your dogs to handle a house fire.
yeah,
Like that amount of stress, I guess I should
that's
say.
good stress because they need to get out. Like that is stress that's going to save their life because they're going to
Yes.
try to get out of the fire. So, stress is not bad by itself, is kind of what I want to make sure that everybody understands going forward here. But we want to minimize it and help our dogs deal with it as much as we can. The first kind of category, when let's say a client comes to us, Sam, with a anxious dog, and they go, "Hey, my dog's got anxiety. Can you help me?" Now we're going to look at it from a stress standpoint. Okay, well, what kind of stress does this dog have going on in their life that we can help with before we necessarily get into the training? The first category that we're likely to look at is going to be health. So your dog's health. Health has a lot of different factors to it. A lot of people, when they think of their dog's health, if their dog is not abnormally unhealthy, they think their dog is healthy. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of common things nowadays that are not normal, but we think of them as normal. So when you think of your dog's health, if your dog has a broken leg, if they have just had a major surgery, so they've got a giant incision, those are obvious. But there are smaller things too, like if your dog has chronically itchy skin, that's an annoyance every single moment of every single day. So when I have a dog come to me with anxiety and their dog is chronically itchy and I can see a rash on their belly and they're just can't stop scratching, that's something that I need to be aware of that I'm then going to tell the owners, hey, we got to work with a vet to work on this. Because if your dog is irritated every day with their itchy skin, then that just adds a lot of stress. So imagine that volcano again. Now we've got magma building up in the bottom because your dog is really itchy every day. And that can be ear infection, so chronic ear infection. It can be chronic GI issues. And that one goes really in depth because it's not just that your dog is pooping their pants if they're having diarrhea. It's that even before that diarrhea, what if their belly just doesn't feel good? And the we can go really in depth on this if we wanted to, but the microbiome in your dog's gut, all of that bacteria in their gut, both the good bacteria and the bad bacteria, influence the hormones in their body, which influence their brain, which influences their behavior. So if your dog has an unhealthy gut microbiome, you're likely to see things like itchy skin and ear infections and belly issues, but we're also going to see a dog that doesn't feel good and that their brain might actually be making them act extra anxious or extra worked up or aggressive just because the hormones in their brains are off. So nutrition and that whole gut microbiome is a big one. In our last episode, we talked a little bit about how certain ingredients in food, like red dye, can cause hyperactivity in animals. And I kind of think of it like, so if Sam were to look at me right now, let's say I had a headache. If she just looked at me on our little Zoom thing, she would have no idea I had a headache unless I told her. But if that headache was making me kind of be slow to respond, if I was like wincing, she'd go, "Hey, what's wrong with you? You're not
Yeah.
usually like that." So we don't think of it this way, but like dogs can get headaches. They
Yep.
can get belly aches without symptoms. The body doesn't have to be in a bad enough state to have physical symptoms for them to just not feel good. So weight gain is another one that I'm very strict about with my clients. And it's not that like, here, I'll go on a rant for a minute, actually, because I am going to be a little mean for a minute. If you're calling your dog chunky and it's cute, oh, he's so chunky, and they're morbidly obese, it's not cute.
Yeah.
because that is going to make their joints hurt. It's going to predispose them to health issues. Now we have behavior problems because they don't feel good. And then it's
Especially if it's a dog who's already prone to having health issues, the addition to being overly satiated and the extra weight that they're carrying around absolutely makes everything worse.
and if your dog is so obese that now they can't go on walks or they can't run, let's use a Labrador for an example, right? Like an active young Labrador. If that dog's obese, now they can't run and chase the ball for several minutes at a time. They can barely do one throw. They can't make it on a walk. Now their joints are at risk of being hurt, which long term is going to make them go on even less walks. Now they can't live their ideal lifestyle, which we're going to get into in a second. That adds more stress. So even your dog being overweight is going to add stress to their plate. And I'm not saying this to be mean, but that is something that you can control, minus maybe a health issue. But then we need to identify what that health issue is and get it under control. But for the most part, 90% of overweight dogs is that we're feeding them too much or we're not exercising. And those are on us. So if you want to fix your dog's behavioral problems, specifically their anxiety, if they're overweight, that needs to be a priority to get quite a big chunk of that bottom of the volcano to go down so we can prevent that explosion. So that's
Yep.
kind of my rant on health. The next category that we're likely to look at is going to be lifestyle. This is a good one for you. So why don't you dive into this one?
Biological lifestyle, or the way we and our dogs live and exist together. A lot of people have different types of breeds of dogs that have different demands and different needs. So I personally, I'm just going to use my life as an example. I have two Belgian Malinois Shepherds. So they are both very different. They both require very different things, but biologically, they are turned on by conflict. So that is something I have to navigate in order to create a life and a space for them to be a pet as well as live biologically happy, where they can express their conflict in healthy ways and appropriate ways. That takes an entire lifestyle change. So I can't allow my two dogs that like conflict to resolve problems themselves. Not going to happen the way I want it to go. And going to lead into it's just going to be a problem. So I have to give them the ability to get their conflict out in an appropriate, healthy way. Therefore, when those two are matched with one another, I don't have conflict. I don't have that problem. And that comes down to, yes, training, but giving them that outlet for fighting, for conflict. I do bite work. I do fun. I do a lot of tug. Tug is my favorite game. And if it wasn't, I definitely have the wrong dogs for that. So if you find that your dog kind of tends to like conflict, like if you push, say they're kind of climbing on you and getting in your lap when you're on the sofa and you go to push them away, like, ugh, get away from me. Sometimes what do? They come back at you. They push back in. They're like, oh, this is fun. We're bumping shoulders. We're pushing around on each other. And sometimes that conflict is really fun. It's just like the same thing with like people who like to box or people who like to wrestle. They find that conflict really rewarding in and of itself. And so when you live a lifestyle where you can get that out appropriately and you can give them that fulfillment there, you typically see the next step we're going to talk about is it comes down to clarity. That creates clarity within the next step of your training program.
So for our listeners, let's say hypothetically that they don't have a dog yet, or they're looking at getting another dog. So they're considering what dog they want to get, not a dog they already have. With this, the layers of stress or our little volcano here, as much as possible, you want to try to just avoid the stress in the first place. So if you get a dog breed or a mixed breed that has a certain temperament that is not a good fit for your lifestyle, you have just added either stress to your dog's plate or stress to your plate. Because if you do right by your dog and you're now doing all the things to let them live an ideal lifestyle, but it's not your ideal lifestyle, now you have stress. And if you're not willing to do that for your dog, now they have stress. So if you're looking to get a dog, you want to look into, well, what type of dog is going to fit my current lifestyle and what I want to do? If you don't want to be active, if you don't want to go outside and play, if you don't want to do things like go on hikes or go to the beach or anything like that, an active Labrador, German Shepherd, definitely not a border collie. That's not for you. So those dogs would drive you up a wall because they need to go
Yeah.
do things. They need to go
Yep.
outside and play and run and get their cardio in, and they need to work their brains. You might want to look into a dog that is more couch potato like, which we're not saying those are bad. Like, he's not back on that sofa right now, but I have one of those. He's my favorite. I have to do a lot of work for my shepherd because he's more active than I am.
Yep.
Now, if you already have a dog and you're finding that you're struggling to give them their ideal lifestyle, now you have to figure out, well, what is their ideal lifestyle?
Yep.
If they're a purebred, you could start there because you
Yep.
could look into, well, what was this breed bred for? Is it something like a husky that's bred to pull things? Is it something like a Australian shepherd that wants to herd things? Is it something like a retriever that wants to pick things up in their mouth and bring them back to you? Is it a spaniel that wants to go run around in tall grass? Like there's
Yep.
all of these things where learn what that dog was bred to do and start there. And that doesn't always mean you have to go to extremes. So like Sam was just talking about how she does bite work with her Malinois. That's incredible. I love that. I've had some of my clients with shepherds and Malinois in the past that weren't into those sports. And then when they figured out how much their dog needed, they got into those sports. So they're doing amazing. But like I respect bite work greatly, but it's just not for me. I'm not a competitive person and it's just not a priority for me. So like with my shepherd, I have to find other ways to give him those conflict outlets. We play a lot of tug, we play a lot of flirt pull, we go on long walks, we go on I don't run, but I let him pull me on my bike. Like there's a lot of things that you can do. It doesn't mean that just because you have a German shepherd, now you have to become a police officer. Or
Yeah.
just because you
Or
have
you
a
have to go do
Malinois,
bite
you're
work.
in the military.
Yeah.
So there are other ways to do it, but you have to figure out what that dog genetically likes to do, and you have to find outlets for them for that.
Unchecked biological fulfillment can create stress. So for a dog at baseline who naturally needs work, who needs outlets, who needs conflict, who needs mental stimulation, that constant day to day, my 2-year-old Malinois is a perfect example. She's a very high drive dog. She needs a lot. And when her lifestyle is not met, say I'm sick, I'm down for a week, I'm traveling, whatever the case is, and she doesn't get the proper work that she would normally get on a day to day, that creates stress. Work is very fulfilling for her. And when she doesn't get it, it creates stress. And that stress sometimes undoes some clarity in her understanding of her baseline existence. She doesn't
Yeah.
understand that she just needs to chill. Like that's just not in her radar right now. So I need to make sure I check her stress on an appropriate lifestyle level for her baseline to be neutral. Sometimes that's what it takes for dogs to be there, or you're giving them too much and we need to bring them back to balance that way. But we're talking about um, the lifestyle and doing things with them.
Yeah. Let's put that into human terms for a second. So, like, I used to be a highly anxious person, like, highly. Ask my husband. I have, I'd say I'm pretty easygoing nowadays. I mean, don't get me wrong. Things are, you get things that are stressful, but I wouldn't say I'm an anxious person anymore. What changed was I went from being a dog trainer on the side, having it be a hobby thing. And I worked full time in an office, sitting in a chair all day at a desk, doing office work, dealing with emails and phone calls of people who are unhappy. Not my ideal lifestyle. I didn't equate that job and that lifestyle to the stress that I had. I thought they were unrelated. But in reality, that unideal lifestyle added so much stress in my volcano that all the little things were the triggers that made me spew over, right? Now that I get to do a job that I love, that is ideal for me, I have much less stress on my plate.
Yep.
Now, let's talk about physical exercise. Well, we'll kind of use physical exercise as an example here. If you told me, let's say you could mandate that I had to exercise for 45 minutes a day. Let's
Well,
say
naturally, your body is not going to handle it the same way because of your health condition versus 45 minutes. I'm not saying I'm better or more healthy, but
here you are.
but 45 minutes of activity for someone who hasn't dealt with thyroid issues is going to be a very different 45 minutes on the body than yours.
Yeah. So that is a factor. But
Yeah.
even just like the type of exercise. So let's say it was mandated 45 minutes of exercise, and let's say you could mandate what type of exercise I had to do. If you told me I had to run on a treadmill for 45 minutes, one, I got low thyroid, I can't do it. But ignoring that, I I hate the treadmill. I almost dropped an
I
F
do
bomb
too.
there. I really hate it. I would be miserable. Would I do it because I had to? Sure. But I would be grumpy the rest of the day. If you mandated my 45 minutes of stress to going on a nice outdoor long hike with my dogs, I'd be so happy the rest of the day. Flip that to my husband. He hates going on long hikes with the dogs. I don't know why. It doesn't make sense in my brain. He's like, I don't like walking for the sake of walking. I feel like I need somewhere to go. But if you told him 45 minutes on the treadmill,
He'd
He
be
does
fine.
that anyway. He loves it. So even when we're thinking of exercise in the lifestyle category, it has to be the type of activity that that dog enjoys and is genetically designed to do because that's
A
how they're
couple
going to
throws in the
feel.
yeah, a couple tosses of a ball in the backyard for my high drive dog is not gonna it's not fulfilling for her. She'll do it any day, all day long, but it's not fun for her.
I've talked about this in some of my social media stuff before, but this would be a good idea for a podcast episode too. There's a difference between fulfilling exercise and frustrating exercise, right? When I talk about exercise with my clients and their dogs, I'm like, what kind of exercise do they get? Well, they run around the yard, they chase the squirrels in the yard. Like, well, that is so frustrating if they want to chase the squirrel and they never get to catch the squirrel. Let's put that dog on a flirt pole and have them chase something they can catch and they can be rough with and they can do it appropriately. So the treadmill for me would be extremely frustrating exercise. The hike is very fulfilling. They both leave me physically tired. One of them makes me cranky and irritable. The other one makes me feel happy and fulfilled so I can relax the rest of the day. So you have to think of things in terms of that too for your dogs, that it's not just cardio or exercise or getting their heart rate up. Does the exercise they're doing make them feel good?
Just another example, my 2 Malinois, I have a slat mill, a wooden slat mill. They both love it, but the 8-year-old male, he's on it for 5 minutes before he's like, "I am fulfilled, get me off of this thing. I don't wanna run." He doesn't even wanna walk. He'll walk, hike all hours all day long, but 5 minutes on the treadmill, he's fine. The crazy girl, she could probably kill herself being on there, like, just not stopping because she finds that just repetitive moving her feet over and over, she finds that very rewarding and she could never get enough. So, I love to give them both the outlets that they need of that exercise, but I have to do it very different.
And I mean,
And
when we talk about lifestyle, it's not just physical exercise, right? There are other
correct.
things too. So social interactions, enrichment, stuff like that. There are some dogs that I see where people contact me and they want the dog trained to go everywhere in public with them. Not necessarily service dog level, but just, oh, I love taking my dog places.
Yeah.
And if the dog doesn't naturally enjoy that hustle and bustle and going everywhere and being pet by strangers, that's going to cause a lot of stress too, even if the dog is well behaved enough to do so. Like
Mhm.
there was one dog that I worked with where they were wonderful pet owners. They took this dog everywhere. But the dog was so anxious and they couldn't figure out why because it wasn't a fear-based thing. It wasn't like he was afraid of the garbage truck and sensitive to noise or anything like that. The dog just had this pent-up stress is what I could identify. And it's because the dog liked going for all of 10 minutes and then he just needed a break. But they were going all day long, here, there, car ride here, sit in the car, go in the brewery, go to the pet store. And the dog's just like, I just need a break, man. So some dogs need more social interaction, some need less social interaction. And I'm not saying go put your dog in a dog park. That's different. That's not the social interaction that I'm talking about. But how much they do in a day is also part of a lifestyle. Do they need more work? Do they need less work? Do they need more downtime to relax? Some don't need any. That all is part of lifestyle too. So, our next category that we're going to talk about in regards to stress is something called clarity. Inevitably, there's always those people where they have the dog that is super, super easy, right? Like they never had to hire a trainer. They did minimal training on their own. The dog just got it. It flowed seamlessly throughout their life. And then usually they call me when they get a second dog or a third dog that is not like that. And the dog just does not seem to flow with the family. All right. What this comes down to a lot of the times is clarity. Some dogs need more clarity than others, some need less clarity. And what that means is it's the amount of information that a dog needs in order to be successful or feel confident in a scenario, right? So I do this in my group classes. And keep in mind that my group classes, I teach reactive dog classes and distracted dog classes. So they're not super obedience based. We do teach obedience, but I take a step back from that a lot. So when I ask my clients, I do this seriously. I say, hey, if I were to ask you what it means when you ask your dog to sit, what does that mean? And everybody looks at me with this stunned face, like, what do you mean? It means sit.
Great question.
And I'm like, yeah, but what does that mean? And they're like, put their butt on the ground. And I say, okay, and nobody knows how to answer that. So a dog that needs little clarity, you can teach them. Sit means put your butt on the ground, and you can have no problems after that. The dogs who need more clarity, we need to teach the dog that sit means put your butt on the ground, don't sniff the ground, should, for depending on how you teach, like in my reactive dog classes, sit means sit in front of me facing me. Some trainers will teach sit in a heel position. So sit on my left side or my right side facing the same direction as me. Does it mean that you have to be staring at me or can you look around? Like there's all of this information and that's going to vary a little bit based on what your goal is with your dog. But for some
And the
dogs,
environment.
yeah, for some dogs, if you don't break that down and teach them the answers to all of those potential questions, then they're like, ah, screw it. This is a hard scenario. I don't know what you want me to do anyway.
Yeah.
And I don't want to copy him here, but I also think that Jay, when I went to one of his seminars, he used this analogy that was just, it really made this clear for people. So, Jay Jack, guys, this is his, I'm not stealing it. I just think it can help you. But he had kind of used the difference of like inviting him versus his wife to a party. And he had basically said that if you invite him to a party, he just says, okay. And then he just goes to your party. Versus if you were to invite his wife to a party, she would ask all these questions like, well, where is it? When is it? What's parking like? What do I need to wear? Is there
I'm
food?
going
Do
to
I need
be
to bring
there.
food? Like she had all of these questions and she wasn't any less capable of going to the party and having fun. She just needed more information to feel confident about going to the party. That is essentially what clarity is. She needs more clarity than Jay did to go to the party. So, where we see this breakdown in regards to training your dog is things like that sit analogy. Sometimes we humans are not super clear on what we're teaching. A lot of the times I'll ask my clients, well, what do you want the dog to do? And they're like, I don't know. I just don't want this. I'm like, okay, well, that's not clear. We
Yeah.
need to really break down what you do want your dog to do and what you want that to look like and all those little pieces of information so that when you're in a scenario, now you and your dog know what you're doing.
Yeah.
And that is essentially what clarity is.
We often see when we meet for people or when we meet clients for consultations, these people rattle off a whole list of commands that their dogs know and that they can do. They've taught them sit and lay down and shake and roll over and all these things. And that's awesome. It's a really good foundation. But can your dog do a sit at the doorway while you answer the door for the Amazon package or the pizza man? Can your dog sit in the middle of a park while there's other dogs running around? Can your dog sit while another dog in person walks by on the street? Like there's a lot of different ways that you can fine tune and clear up the understanding of what sit means. And that is under all these circumstances, no matter what's going on in the environment or no matter what's going on around you, sit is this every single time. And this is what my criteria is for this behavior. And this is what we're going to hold you up for. So if you're not keeping your butt on the ground while dogs walk by you, we're going to fix that. The clarity of the obedience and the clarity of your training is super important for the dog to know. Sit means this every single time. Down means this every single time, no matter the circumstances, no matter the environment, and no matter what is going on around them.
Yeah.
No matter what's at stake as well. Like no matter what the temptation, no matter what they could put, what the dog thinks they're losing out on, doesn't matter. Sit means
Yes.
sit or down means down or whatever the case is.
And for those dogs that do need more clarity, like a lot of people will just go, oh, my dog knows this and they won't do it. And now that human is frustrated and maybe giving corrections. But for a dog that needs a lot of clarity, they might not understand it with the information they're being presented with. They might not understand that it
Yep.
applies to the vet or that it's the same thing as that dog walks by. So then, relating it back to stress, imagine that dog that needs a lot of clarity doesn't have all of the information they need to feel confident. And now you're frustrated at them and you're telling the trainer,
Yeah.
oh, he knows it. Now this poor dog is just so stressed because they never know what to do and they need all this information. Like imagine being the person that needs all the answers to those questions and you go through every day, all day, not knowing any information. That's a lot of stress on your plate every day.
Your dog's lived X amount of time. It could be a few months or a few years or whatever the timeline is in which you decide to get help for your dog. And in that time frame, your dog has lived to this point thinking that everything is fine and that they don't have that there isn't a different rule or there isn't a different way to do a sit. And then all of a sudden we start with a professional trainer and the trainer, we're trying to make it more reliable and more consistent. And the dog's just confused. Well, it's never been wrong up until this point. So what's different? And it's clarity. The dog, when they
Yeah.
really understand, oh, this is what I'm being asked. This is what I'm being paid for my time and my efforts. But another thing with the clarity is how you tell your dog to do it too. If I say it, I explain it to my clients. If you're saying it with a question mark at the end, your dog's going to question whether they should do it. It lay down. Like it sounds, you yourself when you're communicating like that with a
You
question
sound
mark,
unsure.
yeah, your dog's gonna go, "You don't sound like I should be doing that, so I'm definitely not gonna do that." But if you're confident and clear about how you ask your dog to perform those behaviors and you're consistent with that every time, your dog's gonna be more consistent every time too.
With that being said, different dogs have different personalities, right? So, like my 2 dogs that I have, one of them just wants to be left alone. Like, he does not need a lot of clarity anyway, so the more that I tell him, he's like, "Yeah, yeah, I got it." But my shepherd, he needs to be told what to do, not necessarily because he's a bad dog, but because he looks for that. He's like, "Hey, you're my
Yeah.
leader, guide me. Like, lead
Know
me, like, tell me
everything.
what I'm supposed to do." So if I leave him to his, free will all day, he'll just kind of follow me around like, "Well, you're doing that. Like, what do you
Guess
want
that's what
me to
I'm doing
do?
too.
We go out in public. What should I do here? Like, I'm not sure how to behave here." So it would be stressful for him if I didn't tell him what to do. The energy that you bring, but also just the clarity for yourself. What do I want my dog to do? Let's make sure I understand it. Let's teach the dog that. Let's be confident in it. Now we can take a big piece of stress off of that dog's plate just because we're clear in our communication to the dog of what is expected of them and how we're going to get there.
Yeah. And it's a really important thing to have these expectations for your dogs while also teaching your dog that you are going to be clear about it. The clarity in which the dog receives the information and retains the information is super important, but how it is taught to that dog is super important too. Like you were mentioning, some dogs learn really well through pressure. Some dogs don't learn initially well through pressure. Some dogs can handle it, some dogs can't. So it depends on how we teach it. So some people teach it with like upwards leash pressure to teach a sit. Some people would prefer to use like a food lure. Some people would use just tactile feedback, like just pushing on the dog's butt gently till they sit down, something like that. So every dog's a little bit different, and some dogs
Yeah.
wouldn't appreciate their butt being pushed down, or and I'm not saying like mean or anything, but just using that pressure. Some dogs are gonna like skirt around and go, "Whoa, whoa, that's my butt. Don't touch that. I don't like that."
Yeah.
Then then that's not the way to teach that dog to sit. Is there certain times where I think it's important to health in a healthy way push dogs through that stress? Absolutely, but that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah. And even so, with the whole clarity topic, taking a big step back, it's not just about being clear in what we want. We need to create clarity around whose responsibility is it in the household to make decisions, who's the leader. I see this a lot with anxiety cases and also with resource guarding cases.
Yes,
If
yes.
your dog doesn't understand that you're the leader of the household, so I am not talking big, scary alpha stuff. Like, I'm not
Nope,
saying you must be alpha and the boss just because. When
nope.
I talk about you being a leader to your dog, I'm talking about your dog's understanding that you are going to protect them, that you can keep them safe, that you will make choices that benefit them, but also that when you make choices, you're the one that's responsible for all of those decisions, right? And they need to listen. So
Yep.
if a dog doesn't understand that you're in charge or you're the leader and it's your responsibility to determine whether your guests coming in are going to hurt you or not, it's your
Right.
responsibility to determine if that dog walking by needs to be told off. Those dogs who lack that clarity that you're in charge and that you're their leader and you're their advocate, they're going to make decisions because they don't think you can. They're going to go, "Oh, that must be my problem. That must be my responsibility."
Yep.
So
That's my job to handle that.
yeah, you have to create the clarity that you are the leader in the household and that you are, I don't necessarily want to say top of the food chain because that sounds like that alpha stuff, but just that, you're the one where it's
Or
your responsibility to make the decisions. It's not theirs.
they're still domesticated animals in a human world. And although we love them, they're still our companion animals. They are still dogs. They are not babies. And anthropomorphism is something that I definitely wanted to talk about in relation to stress and anxiety too.
Mhm.
Yeah, understanding that you are taking on this animal and putting them like these human ideologies onto a dog that can't comprehend a human societal world, like a dog who like tends to feel a little more reserved and shelled and like introverted, they don't really like big social settings. They're not going to be a dog that you take to a patio. And that's on you to make sure that the dog understands what is being thrown at them, is what they are being challenged with, is something that is tangible that they can overcome and that they can accomplish so they can work through a good amount of stress to create that clarity as well. But
Yeah.
also that you need to believe your program. You need to believe in your training, and whether that's getting
You need to
help
believe in
from
yourself.
Yeah, like you need to believe in your truth with your dog and your program. And when I say program, I don't mean like a private lesson program necessarily with a trainer. It's just what you apply to your dog and what you give them, the output you give them, you want them to receive it. And that transfer needs to be clear. So if you need help getting there, hire a professional. And we talked about that last time, what that looks like. But that's also our job as dog trainers to tell you and show you and prove to you that these truths will create the behavior change you're looking for. It comes down to you being consistent and you being clear for your dog to also, on the flip side, be consistent and clear.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So now we're kind of inching up our volcano here. So once we tackle health and lifestyle and clarity, the next one we're going to talk about is the leash itself. But once we tackle sometimes even just health, like when you're taking health and you're making sure your dog's living a better lifestyle and you're being clear, this is why I tell people that if you have a behavior issue in your dog and you're only teaching obedience, you might not reach your goals because we have to make sure that everything else is going smoothly and that all the building blocks are set so that obedience can even be learned and done
Yep.
successfully. So if you have a anxious dog, a stressed dog, a dog who resource guards, aggression, reactivity, a lot of what I'm going to do as a trainer when I come in is going to be done before we even get to obedience. Obedience comes
Yep.
later. First, we got to
Yep.
make sure that you and your dog can communicate clearly, that your dog feels good. So they're in the right mindset so they can learn, that they don't have all that stress of being pent up and frustrated that they don't get to live their ideal life.
I wanted to piggyback off of when we were talking about clarity, and this does lead into what we're talking about right now. But so think about you just got a brand new job, new people, new bosses, new criteria you're learning, first day on the job, first week on the job, whatever. You're still learning, number one, the layout of the building. Like you're still learning where you go to the bathroom. You're still learning where HR is. Like you're learning all of those things. And within new things creates uncertainty and it creates unclarity. So thinking about your dog, you want to get help. You want, say 3 years old, your dog is, and then you finally start to get professional help. Up until this point, now at 3 years old, your dog has a new job. That's that in and of itself creates lack of clarity because they're being taught new things. So
And
flip
that's
side with
stressful.
it, that's stressful. Within the first week of your job, your boss is telling you you have this deadline for this project, this big project, and all these people are going to come in for a meeting, and you have to present, and you're going to go, what? Like, I don't have near enough experience. I don't have near enough information. I am not ready. And those expectations are unfair or unclear. And that's kind of what we're doing to our dogs. If we're throwing all of these things on them too much and they're not learning right away, or we expect them to stay on a place board while you have your Halloween party guests come in or something like that's just not going to work. Like,
Yeah.
those are incompatible and we have to build them up to understanding the baby steps in which what we're teaching. And that goes into the leash too, because the leash is baby steps of learning incrementally the law of the leash. That's what I call it. The law.
Yeah. Which brings us to our next category of making, stress is the leash itself.
Frustrating.
Yeah. Talk about that.
I kind of think of it as similarly in a silly way, like a child on a leash. Like it's sometimes very frustrating for a child to be told they can't go run off into the street because there's a dog on the other side. Like they don't understand. That's not clear to them. For the flip side on dogs being stuck and tethered on this stupid 6 foot leash when the fun thing is way over there and we're over here and you're the person holding the leash and that makes me more frustrated at you. It creates all of those behaviors we see that we of showing that the dog doesn't understand what it means to be on a leash. It's not just this tie from me to you that's preventing you from getting to the fun thing you want to get to. The leash is an extension of you. It is an extension of your truth in your training program and what you will teach your dog. We teach so much through the leash, and there is so much that is missed in average training that can just be accomplished through general leash training. And I don't
Yep.
mean like a loose leash walking around the block. Like, yes, that's helpful, but genuine communication with your leash, with your dog is so hard for us to convey how important it is, but also just for people to understand it. Because everyone wants their dog to listen without a leash on. Of course, I don't want to ever put my dogs on a leash and I want them to listen to me the very first time I tell them to do anything. How did I get there? How will I get there? It's a leash.
Yep. I I just I was doing this with some clients the other day because I had a group class where only 2 people showed up and it was our last class. And I asked them, "What do you want to work on? Since it's such a small group, let's personalize it." And they're like, "Well, we both are struggling with leash walking." So I'm like, "Okay, cool, we'll do leash stuff." And what I said at first, I could see the confusion on their face. To me, when I, at least in the way that I do my training, the skill of walking on a leash and the skill of heel, totally different things.
Yep.
To me, heel is an obedience command. Regardless of whether that leash is on or not, the dog should be on my left side, right next to me, not sniffing. Like all of those, I have all those questions that I answer for the dog. And sure, to get there, I'm going to start it on a leash. But before I even get to that, just for this whole category of the leash and communication and kind of piggybacking on clarity, your dog has to understand how the leash works, but you have to understand how the leash works. People love to say, "Oh, no, I don't like conflict." But then you take a video of them with the leash in their hand and you put no audio and you let them watch and look how much they like conflict. They use the leash to fight their dog without even realizing it. Your dog goes one way, you jerk the leash this way. You want your dog to come close to you, they take one step, now you just pull on the leash more. There's not any strategy to how they're using their leash. They don't even know what they're doing. So how the heck is the dog supposed to know what they're doing?
Yep.
So with that leash, whether it's to walk around the neighborhood or to help your dog sit in a difficult scenario or to not chew up your pillows at home, your dog has to understand what the leash is and how it works and how to respond to it.
Yep.
Like that is where this is the part where like what we more often think of as dog training, what it starts to look like, because all the things underneath the clarity, the lifestyle, the health doesn't look like dog training, but it is. This is where we get into more of those. You hire a trainer, what you're going to see in a lesson type of stuff.
Yeah. And it doesn't matter if the dog's on a 6-foot leash or a 30-foot leash. Frustration can happen at any point in any radius that the dog is at. And the leash means the same thing, 6 feet versus 30 feet away. It doesn't matter. And it's your responsibility to teach your dog how to respond to certain pressure, specifically leash pressure. We talked about pressure in general with stress and stuff, but I feel like people have a poor relationship with the leash because the law tells them they have to have it on, and like yes, they want to do it because they don't want their other dogs running up to them or their dogs running up to the people or anything. But I still find that within the requirements of a leash, it is still misused. I don't want to say abused because it's definitely not. Sure, people abuse with leashes, but we're talking about just the misuse or the misguidance with it and the overall just miscommunication and the extreme jump that we take between leash on and leash off. Like, there's a huge difference in the way you can hold a dog accountable and the truth within your program when that leash is on and off. And if we hear this all the time, well, my dog listens perfect when he's on a leash, but as soon as we take it off, all rules go out the window. No, then your dog doesn't have a true understanding of that leash, because whether that leash is on the ground, not even in your hand, or you're holding it, draping it over your finger, just like this, it doesn't matter. Like, the dog should respond to the leash the same way. And that comes down, that's what we just talked about, clarity.
So the most common issue that people have with the leash is that their dog pulls on. So I want to deep dive into this for a second because I have a spiel on this. So when we talk about your dog understanding the leash, what we mean by that is that your dog should follow the leash, right? So I'm going to get a little sciencey on all my listeners. I just want you to bear with me, and you can rewind and re-listen to this if you need to. I'll try to break it down nice and small. But there's something called negative reinforcement. So positive reinforcement, which is the term that most people have heard, is when we add something to make a behavior more likely to happen. So we give the dog something they like. We give the dog a treat because they sat. Now they're more likely to sit for us again. Negative reinforcement is when something is taken away to make a behavior more likely to happen. And the best example of this that I've ever heard is what your car does to you when you don't put on your seatbelt. So you get in the car, you don't put on your seatbelt. Your car wants you to put on the seatbelt, so it starts beeping at you. And it's not scary and it's not painful, and you know what it is and you know how to turn it off. So you put on your seatbelt and it stops beeping at you. Your car just took that annoying sound away to reinforce you putting on your seatbelt. Your car used negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement happens with our leashes, whether we're intending to or not. And I would say most people are misusing this, and this is where we create leash pulling. So if you imagine you're on a walk with the dog, you walk out of your front door. Let's say the neighbor's mailbox across the street is where all the dogs in the neighborhood stop to pee. So your dog wants to get to that mailbox and sniff the mailbox. They don't know what a leash is, so they just start walking forward. The leash gets tight. That's uncomfortable. Maybe it's not painful, but it's annoying. But your dog doesn't know how to turn it off. So they keep pulling you towards that mailbox. Now you're getting dragged behind. You're going with them still. That leash is tight all the way to the mailbox. They finally get there. They stop to sniff the mailbox. You catch up. Leash goes loose. Dog goes, okay, cool. To make this leash comfortable, I just need to get to whatever I need to get to. Now we have
Yep.
a dog that pulls. What we actually want to do with the leash is teach the dog that when they feel the end of the leash, when the leash gets tight, in order to make that annoying sensation go away, they need to step in towards you, towards the leash to relieve that pressure themselves. And it's as simple and as complicated as that all at once because there is a technique to that.
I find that those little nuances, because you're right, it is as simple and as complex as that, but those little nuances are really what defines the clarity and the understanding of the laws of the leash. And I also like to think of it as like, yes, we're saying our dog needs to understand it, yet we need to understand it too. But there's ways that you can understand the leash, and I'm gonna kind of like make different references, but I think of it as like GPS. When you and your dog are on, or when your dog's leashed up and you have the leash in your hand, you need to act as if you are the GPS for that dog. Because if you allow them to take control and steer where you're gonna go, you're gonna run into what MJ just said, which is a dog who thinks that they need to find that they need to pull, they need to find the end of the leash pressure in order to begin their walk again. And that's not how we want. I mean, unless you like your dog pulling, but typically we don't want our dog to pull.
So when we break this down, so when I'm working with a client on training their dog, I actually break it down into three categories. In the beginning, when I teach them the leash, you're not allowed to talk. You can say yes when your dog does something right. So when they step in and relieve that pressure of the leash, you can say yes, but you're not allowed to say heel. You're not allowed to say let
Yeah.
go. And what I'm teaching you and your dog is how both of you can use the leash to communicate with each other, or more you with your dog. So you're telling your dog, turn to your left, turn to your right. Now, one of the reasons that the leash can be so frustrating for dogs is something called an opposition reflex. So your dog pulls forward, or they are really interested in that dog or rabbit, and they lunge forward on the leash. And what do? We hold the leash back directly behind them, which triggers something called an opposition reflex, which is basically your dog's instinct to resist pressure, which sets dogs forward. They want to resist that even more.
Turns them on.
So when I'm teaching the leash, I'm teaching the human how to guide their dog to turn to the left or turn to the right and how to not get to the end of the leash and how to release that pressure once they're there. That's
Yeah.
step one of the leash for me. Is just both dog and human being able to move seamlessly without obedience commands on the leash.
Yep.
Step two, that is where I start to build habits. So at least this is the way that I do things. Everybody's a little different. So not all trainers are going to do it this way for those of you listening. But step two is now I want to start to build habits. So I might do these kind of at the same time, but I think of them as two different skills. When you reward your dog, I have you reward the dog on your left side or on your right side, like wherever you want heel to be down the road. That's where the food is going to come from, but we're not using a heel command yet.
Yeah.
I'll also start to reward the dog when they offer you their attention. So your dog checks in with you, we pay that. Your dog comes over to your left side, we pay that. Your dog walks ahead and then they get to the end of that leash and they step back, we pay that. So we start to build good habits around what we want our walk to look like. Step three is then where I put them on cue. Now we're teaching a heel command. Now we're teaching a less casual, like more of a let's go is my more casual loose leash walk. That those can be transferred off leash one day. We're using the leash to teach them, but they're not necessarily leash skills to me. They're obedience skills. We're just using the leash to teach them. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. Back to the opposition reflex. We can even break that down a little to make it a more clear. And that also comes down to tool context or tool clarity too. You use leashes in your training, of course. And I guess where the pressure is coming from on the end of the leash is also a super important thing as well. For me, with my dogs, when I do bite work and bite sports, they have to be on a leash when they're on the field more often than not. But when we're building, they have to be on a leash on a harness. And I want them when when I'm holding the leash behind them and I'm dragging them into the decoy so they can go bite, they're learning pulling gets them closer to the thing that they want to go to, which is bite the decoy. And so with that tool, they're always on a harness. They are never on a collar when that happens. They're when they feel the pressure on the harness, they can go crazy. They can go nuts. They can pull. That's the rule. That's the law of that tool. But when they're on a collar or a slip lead, that kind of pressure is for communication and compliance, is what I say. So when I'm doing bite work with tiptoe and I'm using a slip lead to make her sit or enforce a down or something, that doesn't confuse her to mean pull to get towards decoy so she can go bite, because she understands where like that tactile pressure feeling comes from and what it means because of the clarity and the consistency in which I've shown her this pressure means this pressure means that. And it just depends on where they're feeling it as well. So sometimes we can inadvertently teach our dogs to pull on a harness because when you naturally hook a dog up to the center point in their back, that's where they can access all of their muscles and pull and dig into the ground and really, really get going.
And it's
That feels
comfortable.
feels good and it feels really great. Thinking about like people who like to work out and wear a weighted vest when they're running on the treadmill. I don't know. That sounds like hell to me, but some people like that. So it
Yep.
just kind of feels it's different.
Yeah. I do something so to put it more into a pet perspective for our pet owners. I
Yeah.
do something I call it my little loophole. And I do this, I give this loophole as a tool to my puppy owners and my pet dog owners. So when we bring this all the leash back around to clarity, right? We can create clarity around certain tools. So like Sam was saying in bite work, when her dogs are on a harness, their job is to pull into it. And when they're on a slip lead or a collar, their job is to not. I understand as a trainer that it's impractical for my clients to be dog trainers 24/7.
Yep.
Sometimes you don't have to, you have to get your dog into the vet's office and you don't have time to train them and work on your leash manners. Or you were doing really good, so you went on a longer walk than you probably should have. Now you're a mile from home and you and your dog are both done and you got to go home and cook dinner and you're in a rush to get home. Whatever it is. Now, as much as possible, we want to set our dogs up for success. So we shouldn't be going on those crazy long walks if we haven't mastered our leash skills yet. There's a bunch to be said with that. But dogs can create an understanding around different forms of sensation around the leash, right? So what I tell my puppy owners, my pet owners is when your dog is on a collar, whether it's a flat buckle collar, a martingale, a slip lead, whatever, it doesn't matter. If it's on their neck, the rule is that they are not allowed to pull and you are not allowed to go with them. So that is where we're teaching when you get to the end of the leash, you being the dog, your job is to come back into the leash and make it loose. It's not my job to catch up with you. But my loophole is that if they just want to go on a hike with their dog and they don't feel like training today, or they're too far from home and their dog is frustrated and they're not going to be successful, or they got to run into the vet's office, put them on a harness. If you're consistent, your dog will learn the difference between the pressure on my back versus the pressure on my when the pressure's on my back. Mom says I have no rules and I can drag her over to the grass and smell the smells and she's not going to do anything to stop me. Versus when I'm on a collar, my human is always consistent in that if I get to the end of the leash, I must step towards them. They will not step.
And I can't pull when I feel it there.
So our next level, this is where we get to the top of that volcano, right? So our explosion, where the volcano erupts. These are our triggers. Triggers being anything that invokes a very, very big reaction, or not even very big, but a reaction of some kind out of your dog, right? So when they lunge at the end of the leash towards another dog, when they erupt with barking because the sound in the house startled them, when the man with the hat on the sidewalk is walking towards you and they get nervous. Those triggers are often the things that we think of as our dog having a problem with something. They have a problem with dogs, a problem with men, a problem with garbage trucks. In theory, what Sam and I are talking about is if we can get rid of all of that buildup in our volcano, your dog has
Up
now
into
much,
this point, up to this
yep,
point we just talked about.
now your dog has much more room in that volcano before they erupt. And that is where our triggers are now lower in that volcano, and they're going to be able to better deal with those triggers. Triggers are usually things we can't control. Some of them we can. So we can desensitize to the doorbell. We can build confidence around strange men. We can work on our manners around dogs. Those are things that if we can change them, we should. But there are also things that you can't predict or you can't change in life. Like last the other night was a huge thunderstorm for us. My dogs do okay, but it was a loud one. So my shepherd was a little bit pacey, but he's not erupting because he has all this room, this spare empty room in his volcano that there's not stress. That little bit of stress was not enough to put him over the edge. I'm a light sleeper. It was enough to wake me up and recognize, oh, buddy, it's thundering. We're going back to bed now. Whereas if he was super stressed and he had a big health problem and he didn't get regular exercise and he was forced into social situations he didn't like and I wasn't clear on my communication, then that thunderstorm might have caused a big eruption because he's like, now this is just the straw that broke the camel's back.
Not just that, they could react to that and they can have a bad experience, but that bad experience sometimes can linger, which are things we don't think about for the next day or 2 or 3 days or so because of the extreme cortisol dump that the dogs are getting that is lasting days after that event, and we don't even realize it. We're not even thinking about it because that was so 3 days ago, that can't be the problem. When, say, a genetically weaker dog, that can set them off and create unbalance for 2 or
Yep.
3 days or so, and that absolutely kind of brings you back down to the health aspect of it's not a thunderstorm problem. It's that in this analogy, it's not that. It's a different thing. It's the health or it's the lifestyle, or it's the lack of clarity. Like there's a lot of those things, but that brings us right back down to the first thing is we got to address why the dog feels that way.
And I mean, these can all snowball, right? That's kind of where
Yep.
that trigger stacking word comes back in. Because, okay, so your dog had some mildly itchy skin and then they didn't, they don't get to live an ideal life and you're making them be too social and all these things build. And then that thunderstorm happens and they have a really bad experience because they couldn't handle that extra stress. That stress lingers to 2 days later. Now they're already at the top of their volcano. And now the mailman came, or now you went away on a work trip. So you left your dog home with your significant other, and that's a change of routine. And now
It's
over
stressful.
time, we're having all this stress, and this stress creates a health issue because stress has physiological effects on the body. So now we have hormones in the body. Your cortisol's up. Now we have a health problem, and we just can snowball it into now the thunderstorm's not the issue. The dog has so much stress and other things going on. And now we have to really dive into all of that to take as much off the plate as possible, which is usually the point we're at when you're calling a trainer.
Yeah. Yeah, especially if the dog's taking 2 or 3 days to recover from a scary event. Like, there's so much more that we need to address within that. It's very rarely just the trigger itself. There's a lot that builds up to it. When we get to the point of trigger stacking, we are intentionally looking to create stressful situations or moments for our dogs. Not that they can't overcome. These are never going to be things that we put them in a situation and the struggle outweighs the hope. That one's from Pat Stewart. Thank you. I love that. I say that all the time. So if the struggle outweighs the hope, you're going to have a dog that's going to shut down. They're not going to get out of the situation the way you want. It's just going to be a nightmare. It's going to be ugly. And you're probably going to feel really yucky at the end of it too. And then you and your dog are going to walk away from that situation going, crap, we're both frazzled. We both don't feel good. And then the next time you're going to avoid those situations because of the bad feelings that you and your dog walked away from with. But when we're intentionally putting our dog and exposing them to these different things, say it's not dogs, like a dog having a dog problem. It's not just one dog, but what if it's 6 dogs? That 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 can create stress, but it's tangible. And there's ways that we make it tangible, either by creating space, making those big things really, really visually small,
Yeah.
or we tap into this is something we haven't really talked about, but we tap into their system and get them when all of their senses are in overload in this, we're talking about just specifically in the trigger phase, nose, eyes, ears, all of it is their spidey senses are tingling and they're all just kind of overwhelmed. Sometimes when we take away one of those senses, we can take away the reaction that follows when those senses are in overload. So, for example, a dog who typically tends to hyper visually fixate on something, and that's when you start to see them spiral and get worked up. And I made this analogy earlier the rungs, the
Mhm.
ladder rungs, you see them slowly start getting higher and higher on those rungs. And then that's when we see the tip over and they explode. But if we can disrupt that visual hyperfixation and give their eyes and typically something else to look or think or address or handle or deal with or reward with, we're gonna avoid a reaction. And sometimes it is as simple as some trainers wouldn't do this, but throwing a pile of kibble on the ground. You're
Mhm.
snapping them out of that hyperfixation, and now you're tapping into one of their natural drives, which is hunt and consume. So they get to hunt for their food through the grass or the ground or whatever, and then they get to consume it, thus giving them a sense of a different form of reward. But in a sense, it's dopamine. Their body's receiving a dopamine from somewhere else instead of the feelings that they're going to get from the explosion or the uncomfy feeling they get by staring at that other dog. So when you can channel that into doing something else, and there's other ways that you can do this versus throwing food on the ground, but tapping into that and getting them into a different mindset by channeling that typically eliminates a lot of the trigger responses as well.
Yeah. Let me put that in terms of my group class. So I teach the
Yeah.
reactive dog group class, right? So when I do that, the very first 2 or 3 classes, I will phase these out as appropriate for that class, but the first class, I before the dogs even walk in, I put these visual blinders up. So they're like these big panels that the dogs can't see through, and I can move them around the room. And I basically create a cubicle for each dog. So when the dogs walk in and I have them walk in an order where the dog in the back is coming in first. For the first class, the dogs can't see each other. They
Hmm.
can hear each other, they can
They can
smell each
smell, they can
they
hear.
know the other dogs are there, but they can't see each other. And that makes the trigger of the other dogs much easier to deal with because
Yep.
it's not right in their face. They know the blinders are thin. I mean, they're uh like a fabricy plastic type thing. Like they're not super durable, but they just block visuals. No, what you
Dogs
said
aren't
about
dumb, they know where they're at, they know what's going on
yeah,
around them. It's that you blocking that visual helps
yeah.
create, the ability for the dog to retain.
Yeah, it's like, I don't like spiders. If you told me right now there was a spider in this room, but I couldn't see it, I can deal with that much better than if it was on the wall right here staring at me, right? Now, what you said about throwing food on the ground, I also have them do that in my class. So I always tell them if at any point I tell you to throw food on the ground, just do it and I'll explain it in a second. But I need you to throw food on the ground. So since we're talking about stress, sniffing is a very relaxing behavior for dogs, and it actually activates the part of their nervous system that helps them calm down. So
Mhm.
when a dog is in overload, taking away the visual, but then giving them something to smell, it's not just a distraction. It's actually helping their nervous system regulate itself.
Yep.
So people don't like that because they're like, oh, I'm just bribing it with food, or it's just a distraction. But it goes much deeper than that. We are purposely trying to use their senses in a way to help their body cope with the stress that is in the environment at the
Yes.
moment.
And that is the fabrication of us understanding the dog on such a personal, like, chemical and just component level. Like, we understand the way their brain is thinking, the way they're feeling, well, what we interpret as it is. But
Mhm.
that's the best way we can teach their body to self-regulate because we can't we can see a dog in a fit of distress, so we can't go, "Hey, chill out. Here's a cookie." Like, that's
Yep.
just not going to work. We can't put them on place and make them chill out. Does providing a little bit of structure for some dogs help and create clarity and reduce stress? Absolutely. But for some dogs, that's not enough clarity. And we actually have to get into the root of where this is feeling, where the dog is feeling this in their body and help their body go and do this on their own. Like you said,
Yep.
our goal is eventually that the dog can see a trigger or see a thing that would typically lead to a poor behavior or poor choice, and then their body just naturally goes into decompression because that's what we've conditioned it to do over and over
Yep.
and over and over. But
Yep.
like, we're doing this to not have to do it later on.
Did you just see my face light up with excitement as I remembered the super nerdy story that I want, or like, not story, but like uh, example?
Yeah.
So I believe her name is Dr. Karen Overall, and she has a protocol for like handling stress. And there's something called biofeedback, which is basically if you can get the body to do something, the brain will follow, and vice versa.
Mhm.
So she did this thing where she used clicker training and she taught dogs to take a deep breath on cue, basically. So the dog would breathe in, and when she saw the nostrils flare, she'd mark and reward. And the dogs figured this out, so they would play this game with her where they'd breathe in. And breathing in that deep breath helps the body relax, right? So in the scenarios where she taught it, she didn't need it, but the body knows that that feels good and that feels relaxing, right? And she did this with a bunch of dogs. And what she found is that when dogs were presented with stressful scenarios, because their body and their brain learned that taking a deep breath made them feel relaxed, they
Did it on
actually
their own.
started to take deep breaths around their triggers and they
Mhm.
could calm themselves better, which I just is so cool. I love nerding out on that
That is really
neurological
cool.
level stuff.
Yep.
Kind of going into one more area of this episode. I think it's important for people to purposely teach their dogs how to cope with stressful scenarios. And I'm finding more and more nowadays, and I will get into anthropomorphism another day, which is basically where we put human emotions onto animals. But we, as a human species nowadays, we love to compare our dogs to human children. They're different in a lot of ways, but they're alike in a lot of ways, and it's always reversed on where it would be beneficial to us, right? So with our human children, as a parent, our goal is to create a child that can grow into an independent adult and not need us, right? At least that's a healthy relationship between a parent and a child. So parents will sometimes do things that make their kids a little uncomfortable because they know it's good for them, right? You have to go to the doctor's office and get this shot. You have to do I don't have kids, so I know the specifics are not for me, but I know enough. I've watched enough parents where it's like, the goal is to create a balanced adult. With our dogs, what I'm finding more and more as the years go by is that dog owners want to avoid stress at all costs in dogs. But then what happens is their dogs, when they're inevitably presented with a stressful scenario, because that is just going to happen, that's life, the dogs can't cope with stress because they never learned how to deal with it. So, I'm not saying put your dog in dangerous scenarios. Definitely don't put them in traumatizing scenarios. But a little bit of discomfort can be a good thing to teach them how to deal with that. So, crate training is a good example of this. Even if you don't need it, your dog learning how to settle on their own and be left alone and be in a box is very beneficial. Because what if your dog's in the car with you one day and you're in a car accident and animal control has to come get them because you need to be taken to the hospital by ambulance? They're going in a kennel.
Yeah.
If you need to go on vacation and you need to board your dogs, they're going in a crate. If
Yeah.
they need to spend the night at the vet because they got surgery, they're going in a crate. Yes, even if you don't need it at that time in your life, maybe you don't need to do it, but it's just an example of, hey, I'm going to teach you to be a little bit uncomfortable so you can learn how to cope with this. We're going to do it safely and appropriately. And then that way you have this skill so that next time you're in an uncomfortable scenario, you know a little bit better how to cope with that.
Yep. Like teaching a kid for the very first time how to swim or how to do karate or how.
You're not going to be good at everything the first time you do
Right.
it.
And it's going to suck the first time. No one likes doing stuff that they're not good at. I don't like doing anything I'm not good at. And that's stressful for me starting new things like this podcast, right?
I was just going to say that.
Because it's stressful. New things and uncertainty does create stress, but realistic goals, realistic expectations help push yourself through it. And dogs just don't have that reasoning skill. That's our job to teach them through all of these things we're talking about. There's so much more that goes into it too. But um intentional stress and healthy stress is so good for the dogs to experience, recognize, work through, and then they can reflect at a later time. However, dogs do when they're introduced again to that same stressful thing. Our goal is that first impression or second impression has positive, has lasted to the next impression or the next time they encounter it, that it's a little bit less stressful. And then you see a little bit of progress. It might not completely gone away. But when you can see stress go away each time your dog is around something that typically creates or induces stress, and you
Mhm.
see it shaving off in the end, that's how you know it's working.
So, okay, let's say hypothetically a client reaches out to you with an anxious dog. At what point are you going to recommend they go to the vet and get medication? Because, like, where is that line for you between, oh, this is stress, we can do this in training, versus this is a medical, this is anxiety, there's something going on in the brain, I want you to get medical help?
For me, of course, it's always going to depend. I'm usually never going to recommend that at a first evaluation or consultation because I feel like there's so much we can accomplish without going that route first. But I would say at some point early on in the beginning of starting training, when I can start to see that, like the first three categories we just talked about health, lifestyle, and clarity when we've tried to address those and the behavior really still has not decreased, it has maybe gotten worse or just we haven't really seen big of a change, then I might say that that might be a step. But it is all very different to each subject and each dog, but I'd say those first 3, if I can't really understand within that because if a dog has motivation, especially say it's like a lab or a golden retriever who's overly stimulated, quick and overly excited, has poor leash manners, all of those things, but if they're motivated, they're happy, they like treats, like, I'm typically going to disregard obedience at first because they like treats. I can get them to do anything. If a dog likes
Mhm.
treats, I'm not super worried about that, especially teaching the leash with treats. Like, that's not what I'm worried about. It's those first 3 and conveying the message of how those are important before we address anything else. So I know that's a kind of roundabout way, but
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think I, uh, I tend to not prefer the medication route. I typically recommend it if I can see that The stress level of the dog consistently throughout a day is not just causing, I mean, it's if the dog is living in discomfort for a big majority of the day, like they just can't ever settle down, I'll recommend it. Or if I'm watching the owner be in distress because their
Yeah.
dog's anxiety. I need, like, you got to work together as a team. So sometimes I'm like, hey, talk to your vet. Let's take the edge off. And then we're going to try to get you off of them. I have one more thought before we end this
Yeah.
that I wish I had thought of at the beginning of this episode, because I feel like at this point, the people that this is for have probably dropped off here. They're probably
Yeah.
no longer listening because they're like, my dog doesn't have anxiety. But
My
when
dog's
we go
fine.
back, yeah, when we go back to that, the good stress and the bad stress, so eustress and distress, a dog that is constantly overexcited. I'm talking to you, my doodle owners, my golden retriever owners, my lab owners. If your dog is constantly hyper excited, that is a form of stress on the body that, when chronic, can cause health issues, cause behavioral problems.
Mm.
Even though they're so excited, it's not healthy to live at that level of excitement stress all the time.
Yeah.
So even if your dog is not bad stress, even if they're just good, hyperactive, excited all the time, in order to have a healthy, balanced dog, we still need to bring them down to, hey, you need to be able to relax and turn that off sometimes. If
Yep.
I lived at that level of excitement 24/7, I'd be in a padded room. Like, that's how that works with humans.
I'd
So
probably sleep 15 hours a day if that was the case, because like if your brain and your body is that stressed or just like that high strung all the time, me personally, if I had to be like that for whatever reason, like I would probably sleep 15 hours every day because that's
yeah,
exhausting on my body. I know when
yeah,
I do a lot, not just physical activity stuff, but just a lot of mental strain, sometimes I do need to put myself in a padded room and go, great, I need no sound, no light, no nothing. I just need quiet for my brain to just reset and recharge. And sometimes our dogs are like that too.
yeah. The language that we use can be very powerful in how we approach things. So, like, when people contact me as a dog trainer for anxiety, it's usually when their dog is experiencing the bad type of stress. It's a fear-based, it's a nervous-based type of stress. But the people with the overexcited dog, they don't ever think about anxiety when it is, in fact, your dog has stress. Like, your dog is very stressed, but you don't think of it that way. So it gets ignored.
Yeah.
But it's unfair of our dogs to unfair to our dogs to not recognize that and go, hey, I'm going to help you learn how to be more settled. Not that you can't ever get excited. Be excited in appropriate settings. But
Yeah.
if your dog is just constantly panting because they're so jacked up, that's not healthy.
Yeah. Another way I thought of, just one more thought for explaining some difference in like anxiety and stress, is there's stress that we can talk dogs out of, and then the other type of stress that we need, this is distress, that we need to help and hand hold our dogs through. Sometimes genetically dogs aren't, if they're genetically wired this way, they're not going to be able to get over certain distresses because that's just, that thing makes them uncomfortable, and there's no amount of training or counter conditioning or desensitizing that's going to make them love the thing. They can be neutral to the thing, but they never love it, whatever that is. But in anxiety, when I see it with dogs, they're telling themselves scary stories. They're literally sitting back, watching the scary thing and getting themselves so worked up and so nervous irrationally, that we can recognize it's irrational. And sometimes dogs are just kind of like thrill junkies, and they'll kind of get a thrill off of the anxiety they feel with the trash truck go by or whatever. Like it's just a habitual thing.
It's kind of like how I love movies that make me stressed out. My husband doesn't understand it. He's like, this movie's stressful. Why do you like it? I'm like, I don't know. I like to feel stressed during movies. Like, it's kind of like that's how I'm imagining it. Some people like relaxing movies. Some people like stressful movies.
Yeah,
I don't know.
that's interesting. But like, I don't know. I guess I don't know really know what stressful movie you're talking about. But
You know, when you
uh,
watch a movie and you're on the edge of your seat and you're like tense.
I guess it depends on what the movie is too. I'm such a snob with that. But
See, I'll watch anything and I get really into it.
the dogs are telling themselves scary stories. They're psyching themselves out, and it's like sometimes it's an easy way we can snap our dog's attention out of it and say, hey, don't focus on that, do this. And they can go do another task happily with the thing that normally was making them stressed or bark or overexcited or whatever it is. Like sometimes you can talk your dogs out of that, and then sometimes you just can't. And just kind of sometimes that's the dog you have. and you're always going to be doing some work to keep them at like a zen balance within themselves. But sometimes that's building them up. Sometimes it's taking stuff away. It's a lot of all of that. But it's super important to recognize the difference between what kind of stress and how we can implement good stress and bad stress to get a stronger dog, like a mentally stronger dog, but also having patience and understanding that sometimes no amount of training is going to change the way your dog feels about that trash truck. You can get them to ignore it, but that's sometimes the most you're going to ask from them. And that's kind of a vague example, but like the vet's another one. Really common for dogs to not like vets, and that's okay. They don't have to like it, they have to tolerate it. And sometimes that's a stressful thing. But just because they're stressed doesn't mean they get to pop off and go biting everybody in the room.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I definitely want to talk about vet visits for those dogs that struggle in an episode because that would be, I think, really helpful and really fun to
I
talk
mean,
about.
I think you and I have a lot of experience with with trouble dogs at vets. So
And I feel like honestly, just in this last year and a half, 2 years, I've kind of fine tuned what works for me really well when it comes to the vet, and it's actually not obedience.
yeah.
Because I used to be really obedience heavy. No, you must sit, and that didn't work. It made it worse. Not that it always will, because dogs are different, but I just think that would be a really fun topic for us to get into. So, I guess to sum it up, because I'm sure people want to go do other things now that we've been talking their ear off for a while. Our goal with this episode is not necessarily to just solve all of your problems because there will be more in depth topics that Sam and I can go into in separate episodes.
Yeah.
But I just want people to understand that just because you have a quote unquote anxious dog doesn't always mean that your only option is medication or that there's nothing you can do. I want to make sure that we recognize that we can take stress off of their plates and help them better cope with it because there are things we can do in training or just in working with your dog that aren't necessarily just obedience, but go deeper than that to help them feel better.
I don't remember if it was this episode we were just talking or if it was the last one, but the client that I was mentioning that the dog for the first 4 years of his life didn't need to be crated. And then at 4 years old, he needed to because all of a sudden too much freedom in the house was just too stressful for him and he couldn't handle it. And he psyched himself out and he was telling himself scary stories, running back and forth from this window to this window to this room to this back here, just whining and barking and pacing and panting and not drinking water and not eating and not like no self-regulation, no laying down. But the moment a crate, even though he'd only been in the crate a few times, and those few times were stressful for him when he was a puppy, but bringing the crate back into his life, even as an adult, has taken away so much stress off this dog's plate and the owner for that matter. But it's created clarity. And the dog is now he's a little stressed and he'll still pant and like salivate and stuff in the crate a little bit, but it's created so much clarity and has taken stress off of his plate just by the act of showing him how to chill, how to settle,
Yeah.
how to relax, how to be by himself and be okay with this.
Well, it's also probably like decision fatigue. I mean, as a business owner,
It
I
is.
have to make 5 million decisions in a day, right? By the time my husband and I are both home from work and he's like, "What do you want for dinner tonight?" I have literally said, there's been multiple times where I'm like, I can't even just no, you make the
Yep.
decision. I don't want to be a part of that because I
Yep.
can't make any more decisions. So some dogs,
Executive dysfunction.
imagine they have freedom all day. They are constantly making decisions of what they're going to do and what they're going to bark at and what they're going to sniff. Some dogs, they're like, I can't make any more decisions. And it's like their brain starts to fry. Yep. And that taking the decisions away. No, you're going to go in your kennel and relax, or you're going to go on place and you're going to take nap time over here on place in obedience. That can just be like, oh, thank God you made the decision for me. I don't have to.
Yep. Yeah.
So think of it like that too. Decision fatigue is kind of a good way to think of it when those dogs have too much freedom.
And too many decisions. And sometimes they're just bad decisions. They don't think of them as bad. They feel bad when they're, running back and forth from window to door to this to that room because they're so anxious. And it's like, there's so much room in this house to be anxious. And that's kind of how I explained it. He's like,
Let me go be anxious over there.
it's exactly what it was. And that's what he was doing. And then it was literally, it took us the moment of putting the crate together, saying go in, and he just went in and laid down. And we were like, okay, like this is cool. There's a little bit of training that went into it, but literally he was just like, okay, I'll do this. And he's crate trained. So
Yeah. My
yeah,
shepherd loves his crate. Like he is stressed if he can't get to his crate. And I mean, he's in there right now. He's literally right here in his crate right now, napping, and he's just perfectly settled. He's a resource guarder. It's not enough to be a severe problem, but he resource guards with the other dogs in the house. And when we first moved into this house, I remember I called you actually because I was like, what gives? Like, it's never been this bad. Why am I having this problem?
Oh,
And
yeah.
you had asked me about his crate. And I was like, no, I put that in the basement. I don't need that anymore. It takes up too much space in this house. And I think you were like, MJ, you know
Oh,
better. So what did I do? I went downstairs, I got his crate, I brought it up, I put it in the bedroom, problem solved. I mean,
yep.
he still has appropriate resource guarding. So like the other night, he had a little like Kong like toy, and my older dog came up and was like trying to lick it out of his paws, and he growled. And I said, good boy, Graham, like Max, you got to back up. That's inappropriate of you. You can't bother your brother while he has a toy. But for a little while there, I was like, oh my God, I am going to have a resource guarding problem. And it was just that he felt
If
like
you
it was his responsibility.
Yeah,
But
and if you didn't change that lifestyle, if you didn't change that little tiny bit about yours and his lifestyle that he was living, it was really his, then you would have had a worse problem on your hands. But because you
yeah,
made that small change, that of lifestyle that created clarity, which then your problem
yeah.
is less and more manageable.
Now, let me be very, very clear for our listeners. When I'm talking about how I brought Grimm's crate back in relation to his resource guarding, I hardly ever shut him in his crate. The door stays open.
Yeah.
What happened was he knows because I have always just taught him through history. His crate is his. I do not allow the other dogs to come bother
Yep.
him in the crate. I do not allow people to come bother him in the crate. So even though the door stays open and I didn't tell him to go to his crate and shut him in there, he had the skills necessary to recognize I'm feeling stressed right now. I'm going to go to my crate to decompress, and mom will make sure that nobody bothers me.
Yep. And that's on us to make sure that our dogs understand that we could go on for more hours about this, but
Yeah, we
advocating
will.
for their space, ensuring that other dogs are going to be respectful. We're going to hold them accountable. We're going to make sure that the environment we ask them to perform in or be in is going to set them up for success, whether we're training or not. It would be very unfair. It also creates lack of clarity when we go in and out of lifestyle as well. But I guess that could be for a different day.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I'm sure people are tired of listening to us talk. So, any big last notes?
There's a million. If you guys have questions, if we asked or if we said anything that was unclear, you want us to kind of hone in on and get a little bit more deep dive, let us know in the comments. We're kind of spitballing right now and going from there. But if there's something specific that we touched on or we didn't touch on and you guys want to hear a little bit more about, just let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm actually in the show notes for this will be that link for the Google form where you, as the listeners, can submit questions or topic ideas. I'm actually also going to attach, I have a PDF on this little like layers of stress and all these categories. So, I will attach the PDF there so people can print that out if they want a visual. And then, Sam, where can they find you?
You can find me on Facebook or Instagram, Canine Insight LLC.
Perfect. And then for the podcast itself, we have an Instagram and a TikTok. It's at On Dog Terms. And then my personal, so my or not my personal, my business through Cape Canine Academy is on Instagram and TikTok at MJ underscore the dog trainer. So we will leave it at that and we will see you all next time.